last class, we talked about the interrogation and detention memo, the torture memos, as they're called. So we talked about the Glenn case, that was the court-martial case. And I think we should ask ourselves whether we are condemned to repeat our own history in this area. We seem to make the same mistakes repeatedly. We considered a couple of the specific techniques that OLC evaluated in its opinions. And I think at least some of us thought that some of the techniques on the table clearly were torture. But I think a number of us also thought that a number of the techniques that were discussed were not torture, at least when used alone. It gets more complicated when you start to see them used in combination, and also in the context, larger context in which they're being used, especially if you are held in incommunicado detention. Then we thought a little bit about the subsequent developments, what happened after the John U. Bybee memos, and OLC withdrew those opinions, issued a subsequent opinion also interpreting the torture statute, but suggested it wouldn't have come out differently on the merits, even under the more modest interpretation of torture in the latter memo. Then the Hamdan case, the Supreme Court case, sweeps through and renders a fair amount of this moot because it concludes that Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions applies to all US government officials and its conduct in this armed conflict with Al-Qaeda. So this leads to that Bush executive order we talked about that interprets Common Article 3 quite narrowly, especially the provision on outrages on personal dignity. The idea there is to protect the CIA, maybe for activities it had engaged in the past, and also to leave some room for somewhat controversial interrogation techniques, even moving forward. Then President Obama comes in and he walks back that executive order and introduces his own that returns the US interpretation of Common Article 3 back to kind of the more conventional interpretation of that treaty provision. We also talked about the internal Department of Justice machinery that kicked in. There was 2 reviews within the Justice Department reviewing the U and Bybee analyses, and those came out different ways as to whether those attorneys should be sanctioned for their legal analysis. And of course, as we've talked about, Congress produces this gigantic report on rendition, detention, and interrogation many years later. That's the Senator Feinstein report. So I think the takeaway should be, what will we do if and when we confront similar security issues again? What is the, do we have a takeaway? Do we have the right takeaway from the ups and downs of what we talked about? Okay, current events. Some excitement since we last met. Yeah, please, James.
The Pentagon is planning to bolster its special ops forces.
Do we know how many?
I think it was it 50? I can't remember.
So I think that was the number they'd already said. I think they're going to ramp up, and they haven't identified precisely by how much. So these are identified as special ops forces, but let's not kid ourselves. These are ground troops, right? And the idea would be that they can conduct things like night raids, get better intelligence on the ground, and so on. Greg?
It's interesting that the Iraqi Prime Minister, though, then said that we don't need foreign combat forces, to which John Kerry then responded,
yes, you do.
Them on this. So I don't
you
know,
think you don't.
Political theater probably wanted to look strong, but it certainly didn't look good.
Right. I mean, in some ways it makes you look weaker rather than coming out and saying, the U.S. asked us if they could come in and we affirmatively said yes, as in we have the authority to give them permission or withhold it. They sort of got the worst of both worlds there, right? Because they say, well, only on our watch, but you know what, the U.S. is going to go in anyway, right? Because it has this alternative self-defense theory, potentially, even absent Iraqi consent. Brooklyn?
Turkey shot down a Russian jet. They sort of invaded its airspace.
Right. Do you know what the U.S. has said about it? Right, because people are saying, well, what is the intel? Was the Russian plane in Turkish airspace or not? Anyone see what the U.S. has said? So it actually confirmed, based on its intelligence, that the plane was in Turkish airspace, but it hasn't said anything about whether Turkey was correct as a matter of law or policy to shoot down the aircraft. I think trying to stay as neutral as possible. Leah?
In the wake of the shooting down the bomber, Russia has been installing missile defense systems at its bases in Syria.
Oh, good. I hadn't seen that. I mean, I think this is some of the military adventures we saw in this class were done. So in Iraq, it was a coalition of the willing. Everybody was on board. There was a single commander. When NATO responds, there's a unified commander as well. It's unified operations. And here we have people, not a state, important big states, not coordinating in the same coalition, even though they're not directly fighting each other. And I think these kinds of things show what some of the problems are with that. Yeah, Logan.
In response to that, Turkey, there's speculation that they might limit or shut down Russian access through the Bosphorus Straits, which it's under a provision of international law that actually predates the UN. But what's weird about it is it is triggered by, I guess, wartime conditions, which Turkey decides. So if it escalates to a point, they could legally be allowed to do that.
And so the idea would be basically that Russia and Turkey were at war? I hadn't seen that. That's interesting. Adriana? Okay. Lauren?
There was a piece of the national security letter that was allowed to be released. There was an individual who had received it. He owned a small ISP. He received the letter in 2004 and challenged it. And this was just the last piece. The government was maintained that couldn't release what had been asked for.
Yeah.
So finally, actually the opinion from the SDNY was in August, but there was a 90-day period. The government didn't challenge it. So this was the last piece in kind of showing what the FBI would ask for with these letters. And I read a piece of the opinion. It was kind of, so much of this information is public already. The government can't really say that releasing the actual letter that this person received
Right.
from a request would pose any kind of danger.
Yeah, were you guys, I don't know if anyone else saw this news item, but were you surprised at what the revelation was? What the FBI had asked for? I thought it was sort of a no duh, right? It was a single client, and it was his email, all of his email addresses, phone contacts, but it was not the substance of his emails to other people, right?
Specifically said we're not asking
Exactly.
to provide any content.
Exactly. So I feel like the government shouldn't have fought that release for so long because it's not a bad news story for the government. I think it actually shows a fair amount of restraint in what they were asking for. Anyone else? Let's see. So I had two other things. The USA Freedom Act has finally kicked in, and Section 215 of the Patriot Act is no more. But there are still questions about kind of what do you do with the residual information that you had collected under 215. I think there will be some sort of continued litigation. And the government is in a litigation posture where it has to retain a whole lot of this information because it's in litigation with people who are alleging they've been spied on. So ironically, the civil rights, civil liberties groups that have brought this litigation are the cause of the US government retaining lots and lots of this information. An irony I'm sure that is not lost on the US government. And finally, there was a report that Chinese espionage, the commercial espionage that we've talked about before, has actually fallen off in the wake of the commitment by President Xi to knock it off. And there was some report that in the meeting that the Chinese at a senior level have had with the US over the past week, the Chinese are now asserting that the theft of the OPM data was actually a criminal act and not committed by state actors. So I don't know quite what to do with that, but that's where we are. Okay. So I want to turn to today's topic. So we've studied detention for a number of classes. Those raise jus in bello questions. We also talked about what it means to take direct part in hostilities. That's also a jus in bello question. And so what I want to think about a little bit more today is a couple of other jus in bello principles that regulate targeting. I think it's helpful to understand these rules when we turn to thinking about drones, because they implicate these questions. So what I want to do first is talk about 3 substantive jus in bello rules that relate to targeting. So distinction, proportionality, and precautions. And then I want to talk about the use of drones, including by the CIA. And I want to break down and think about some of the underlying debates that have made the use of drones so controversial. And then, if we have time, I want to talk more specifically about targeted killings, right, which you can conduct not using drones. You can use drones, but you can also use them through other means, and how that relates to this question of what the geographic scope of the conflict with Al-Qaeda is. How it's not just limited to Afghanistan, but the US thinks it extends more broadly to other areas. And then finally, if we really have time, and I don't think we will, I want to talk about the interaction between 2 bodies of international law, the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict on the one hand, and international human rights law on the other. It'll come up a little bit, I think, towards the end of class. Okay, so I want to start with substantive targeting rules, the 3 that are most relevant to us. And the first one is distinction. So this is a principle that's thought to be customary international law. It's specifically spelled out in the Additional Protocol 1 of 1977, to which the US isn't a party, but the US accepts this as a matter of customary law. So the idea is that if you're fighting an armed conflict, you have to distinguish between the civilians, meaning both civilian people and civilian objects, things like schools and churches, on the one hand, and military objectives, which include both the armed forces and things like tanks and aircraft, military aircraft, and so on the other. You need to only target the latter. So the principle of distinction is spelled out, refers to military objectives. So we might ask, well, what specifically is a military objective? How do we think about things that are not just squarely tanks, but other things used by the military? And this is the definition that Additional Protocol 1 tees up. So it's objects that by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action by your enemy. Okay. This is also, these are provisions in your book as well. Okay, so we'll come back to this question, but I want to back up first, briefly, and ask, why shouldn't one state that's fighting another state in an all-out war be able to target the entire population of its enemy, civilian or military, right? This is a war in which our goal is to win. We want to bring the enemy to its knees. Why isn't that where we end up in the laws of war? James? Paulos? Why not just go after everybody? Say we're in an armed conflict with Russia. Yeah, we want to take out the Russian military, but hey, why stop there?
I guess it just goes back to also, you wouldn't, I think, neither state would want that in retaliation on your own population as well.
Okay, so there's clearly a proportionality issue here. Remember, we're in an interstate armed conflict. This is not the US fighting Al-Qaeda, this is US fighting Russia. So there's a reciprocity concern. Why else? James, any other thoughts?
I guess also the practical effect, taking out the civilian population, would that actually be able to help the military objectives or not? And if anything, might really redouble the other countries' efforts
Right.
to attack you.
Right, so both things, right? You might really then bolster the Russian civilians' commitment to wipe you off the map, And also, as robust as the military is, it has limited capacities, limited weaponry. Why waste your missiles and your flight runs and all that taking out people who aren't fighting you, right? You really want to go after the Russian jets and the Russian tanks. It is just simply, I think maybe the first thing you said is perhaps the most important reason. There's a humanitarian goal undergirding all of this, that states have just decided that it is inhumane to target people who aren't directly involved in the fighting. Okay, so James, what if you conduct wide-scale bombardment of military targets in Russia around the country, and that bombardment campaign terrifies all of the civilians? Is that a violation of the laws of war?
I think it says, is this targeted on the military targets there?
Right. It's a byproduct of being engaged in an armed conflict, but that wouldn't pose a specific violation under the laws of war. You're not allowed to terrorize the civilian population as such, but using military strikes on military objectives might strike fear in their hearts, but it is not a violation. Okay, so we have to distinguish between military objectives and civilian objects. And in some cases that will be easy. But I want to work through a couple of hypotheticals that show that it can be a little more complicated than all of that. So let's assume that China invades the east coast of the United States, lands near Norfolk. And the People's Liberation Army has to determine what it can target in and around the Charlottesville area. Let's see, Alvin, can it target a military base?
Yes.
Can it target the rotunda?
No.
Civilian object, right? Can it target a landmine sniffing dog that the U.S. Army has?
Yes. That would be like a targetable enemy combatant.
Right. As cold-hearted as that sounds, you can target the landmine sniffing dog. How about a railroad bridge over which both civilian passenger trains and military trains travel?
I would say probably yes. It goes towards the logistical capacity of the enemy you're fighting. So.
Right. So I think we would say the destruction of that railroad bridge would offer a definite military advantage if the all of a sudden the U.S. can't get its equipment to where it was trying to take it on the train. Alvin, how about a church that is used impermissibly by U.S. Army snipers?
Yes. Okay.
Yep, military objective. How about the CIA headquarters in Langley?
Yes.
Yes, assuming that intelligence that the CIA is gathering is making a contribution to U.S. War efforts, and it seems likely that it would. Okay, so during the U.S. Civil War, the North believed that the sale of cotton was providing funds for almost all of the Confederate arms and ammunition. Alvin, could the North, as a result, destroy the raw cotton?
That's a little bit harder.
That's why I'm asking you.
I could see them certainly doing an embargo or setting up a blockade. In terms of destroying the raw cotton, that might be targeting the civilian population a little bit too much. Might be a little bit on the other side of the line.
Does everyone agree with that? Anyone think it's targetable? Ann, did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it is, because if that's how they're financing the military campaign, then that would be a military objective. So I would
Okay, so Ann, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think you can distinguish that if it were like wheat or some sort of food crop that the population depended on for literal survival. I think that is more unacceptable than just a cash crop type situation.
Okay, I agree. That's a useful distinction. James?
But can you stretch too much the argument then that anything that's tax-paying in the end is financing war, and you create an argument for destroying everything?
Right.
Even a personal property, because it pays personal property taxes, finances war.
Right. So, yeah, Alvin.
I was also going to say, even if maybe you could, you might not want to for the same reasons that we distinguish anyways. Because, like, say, Afghanistan, if you go and wipe out all the poppy and the heroin plants in the South,
Right.
That's just really going to upset the population
Right.
and support out there.
That was James's point on the not if you agitate your enemy too much, the civilian populace might rally behind the government.
Yeah, so
Greg.
that's a good policy reason, but as far as like from a legal perspective, I feel like it only almost turns on like approximate cause kind of rule, like how close is it? Like are the funds going directly to the military, or is it kind of being funneled through taxes? You know, that doesn't necessarily give you a firm line, but I think it's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, so frankly, Ann's position is basically where the U.S. government is, and Alvin is where most of the rest of the world is. So the U.S. government takes the view that in some circumstances, it is okay to target war-sustaining activities. And in this case, in the Civil War, if you took away the cotton, the Confederacy arguably wouldn't have had any ability to buy arms and ammunition. But others think that that creates a real slippery slope problem along the line James identified, which is, okay, well, if it's anything that's providing funds from the citizenry to the military, then why not civilian bank accounts and so on? It really takes you down a slope. So the usually accepted rule is that you need a proximate nexus to the war fighting, that just war sustaining is probably not sufficient. Okay, Alvin, I've got a few more for you. A privately owned factory that's manufacturing bullets for use by the U.S. military, can the Chinese target that?
Yes, I think they could. Again, that would go towards the military capacity in the U.S.
Right. Even if there's civilians in it who are sitting there making the bullets?
Yes.
Yes, although it raises a question about proportionality, which is something we'll talk about in just a sec. How about a military hospital?
It would depend. So if it's just got the Red Cross on it and it's not being used as a warfighting function, then no, I don't think it could be targeted. But if that same hospital was a command center, then yes, it could be.
Right, so if you're using it like you were using the U.S. Army snipers were using the church, then the answer is yes, though you may still have proportionality problems. But if it's just a military hospital doing its business and treating prisoners, then the answer is no. So it is a military facility, but there are specific other rules that make it a protected building. All right, last one, Alvin. Retreating U.S. troops. The U.S. starts to panic, and they all turn around and start to flee this region. The Chinese are just making good headway.
Yes.
Can the Chinese target them?
They're still enemy combatants.
Yes, that's correct. Well done. The only way to I know he has a military background, in case you were wondering. The only way to immunize yourselves from attack as a combatant is to surrender, or if you're wounded. But in my scenario, it would be to surrender. So some cases of distinction are easier than others. And the trick is to look at how clearly something is being or will be used for military operations. Okay, so the bullet factory raised this question about proportionality. What is that? So I've put the basic rule up on the board. You are not allowed to conduct an attack against a military objective if the expectation of the incidental loss of life to civilians or damage to civilian property would be excessive in relation to the military advantage you expect to gain. So even where you pass the distinction test, and you have to pass the distinction test, you still have to deal with proportionality problems. As with our ammunition factory workers in that hypothetical. So there are two things I want to be clear about here. The first is that this proposition is only relevant when you are thinking about targeting a military objective that has civilians in or around it. Right? If you're trying to strike a stream of Russian tanks who are headed into Siberia and you don't think there are any civilians around, proportionality is not a question. And the second thing I want to be clear about is this is different from jus ad bellum proportionality. right? They both use the same word, but they mean different things, right? This is asking about whether you can, what level of collateral damage, it's basically the euphemistic term used here, what level of collateral damage is acceptable in targeting a particular object. Use ad bellum proportionality relates to the overall, your general size of response to an incoming armed attack. You guys see the difference? Okay. Okay, Adriana, I have a question for you about use in bello proportionality. Why might this be a difficult rule to apply if you're a military officer?
It could be different because you may not have full information on the presence of civilians. You may not know exactly where they are. You may not know exactly how many there are there. So it might be hard to do the balancing test if you don't have full information of what's going on the ground.
Right. So that's an important reason why this is a hard rule to apply. We have what's called the fog of war. Especially if you are targeting something, there are pre-planned targets, and then there are targets of opportunity. In a pre-planned target, you scope it out in advance, you have a good sense, not a perfect sense, but maybe a good sense of where civilians are and are not. Especially when you're talking about targeting on the fly, all of a sudden someone you've been following runs into a building, you don't know how many civilians are in there, it gets more complicated. The test there, how to deal with that, is you apply a standard of what a reasonable commander knew or should have known. And if you get it wrong, for reasonable reasons, and lots of civilians die, it's not a war crime. You have not violated the principle of proportionality. Can anyone else see other aspects of why this is hard to apply? Alvin?
Well, if you've got like the head, you have Osama bin Laden and he's got 300 civilians around him. You know, taking him out proportionally you might be saving a lot of loss of life in the end. So it might be worth it, even with a significant civilian population loss.
Right. Well, this test has you think about both things when you're running it through the system, right? Because in your hypothetical, the concrete and direct military advantage gained by killing Osama bin Laden is very high, at least in the US view, right? So that would allow you to incidentally harm a greater number of civilians than if you're talking about a ground soldier, right? I think the way it works within the US chain of command is that the more significant the target and where you have a significant target and a likelihood that a lot of civilians will be killed, and by a lot, I think I mean more than 5 or 10, I think the decision goes all the way up the chain, potentially to the Secretary of Defense. Do we want to impose this harm given the value of the military target? But it raises a question about what's excessive, right? There's no definition of excessive in the treaty. And it is largely self-judging, right? The military that's undertaking the strike judges what's excessive. Anything else hard about this definition? Yeah, Mark?
I think in some ways you're kind of comparing apples and oranges.
Excellent, right, yes.
You know, like civilian innocent lives have nothing to do with the war versus a military objective, and how do you weigh the value of that life versus they're just so different.
Exactly, right? There's an incommensurability here, and there's no guidance really as to reconcile it. So it feels a little bit like a smell test. Okay, any questions about proportionality, use in bello proportionality? Okay, the third principle I want to mention is, oh yeah, please, Austin.
So in situations where there's no effort made by the state to differentiate who's a civilian and who's not in terms of fighting in the war effort, how does the proportionality standard change? Well,
the hypothetical tees up a war crime, right? So your hypothetical has a state that is not even heeding the principle of distinction, right?
No, I mean, like in terms of the state that's being targeted, if they don't make an effort to distinguish among civilians and people who are.
Wait, the state that's being targeted, or the state that's doing the targeting?
Being targeted. Like, how would that affect the state that's doing the targeting? How would that affect?
Oh, so if, for example, you have Russia fighting from within Moscow, and they establish a bunch of military bases right in the thick of their civilian population, how does that affect how we target? So that's a good question. Russia, in that context, is potentially violating, not potentially, is violating the laws of war to not try to separate out its military operations from its civilian population. But at the same time, it doesn't relieve our obligation to comply with, the best we can, the proportionality rules. It makes our job harder, but we don't want to fall into the trap of blowing through the laws of war just because Russia blew through the laws of war. Okay, so precautions in attack. So precautions end up being pretty important these days, where so much fighting takes place within urban areas. So in the kind of situation that Austin just described. So for example, in the Israel-Hamas conflict, where Israel has to do a lot of targeting in Gaza, it actually came up more recently in the Kunduz Doctors Without Borders hospital that got targeted. This too is thought to be a customary international law rule, but like the other rules we've talked about, it's contained in Additional Protocol 1 as well. The idea is that those actors who are planning the attack, so in Austin's hypothetical, the US trying to strike in the heart of Moscow, they have to take certain precautions. So the first thing is they have to do everything feasible to verify that the objectives they're attacking are in fact military objectives. They're expected to choose the methods and means of attack to either avoid or minimize incidental injury to civilians and civilian objects. So that might, for example, affect the kind of weapon you choose to use against a particular target. Some have wider blast radiuses than others. And you're also supposed to give effective advance warning of attacks that may affect the civilian population, unless circumstances don't permit. So there's an out, but the idea is to minimize the possibility of collateral damage before you conduct the strike, not after. You can't minimize after the strike is done. This is to try to get civilians out of the way beforehand. Does anyone know what roof knocking is? Brooklyn.
It's the Israeli method of warning civilians about a strike, so they'll either send a defunct, like, missile into a building or some sort of something into a building to let people know that the next one coming is not
a dud?
Yeah, it's not a dud. It's going to be more powerful to give people a chance to get out.
Right. So my understanding is they try to use smaller explosives that they do explode on the roof, but they don't do significant damage to the building. And it's a signal to people who live in that building to get out of the building because it will be the subject of a military strike. Israel also calls Gaza residents, I guess it has them all on speed dial, and leaves voicemail messages on their cell phones saying that they're going to bomb houses where weapons are found. So if you happen to live in a building that you know, maybe you're not Hamas, but you know that Hamas is storing some stuff in the basement, it puts you on notice that you better get out of there. There's also a form of precautions that's called leafleting. So you drop leaflets over the area that you are potentially going to target, or you're trying to communicate to the enemy population a certain thing. So this is a leaflet that Israel dropped in Gaza that urges civilians to avoid being present in the vicinity of Hamas operatives. Maybe relevant to us, the US is reportedly leafleting oil tank drivers in Syria. So ISIS is making a lot of money off oil, and the US has decided to target that oil, presumably as a military objective. And it may be doing that, it may be leafleting the drivers as a matter of policy, or maybe as a matter of law, right? So if the driver is a member of ISIS that's transporting the oil to his headquarters, he's potentially targetable. But there may be uncertainty about who the people are who are driving the trucks. Maybe ISIS has forced civilians to drive it for them, and so on. So I think the leaflet says, we're going to target oil trucks, you should get out and flee. And I think they've seen some people actually leave their trucks. Lauren?
Kind of a related question, maybe it's a little messy because it's ISIS, but I think there are reports that they're forcing people to stay in Ramadi because there's indication that there's going to be an offensive in there. And ISIS is allegedly blocking people from leaving. They want civilians to be there. So where does that put us or the Iraqi forces?
Right. Anyone know what that's called when you do that? Mark? Yeah. Right. So that would be using civilians as human shields, which is a war crime. And this goes back to Austin's question. Does it mean that we can just blow through it and take everybody out? No. And in fact, both as a matter of law and policy, that would not be in the US best interest to do it. But it surely makes it more complicated. This is what has agitated the Israelis for years, because they say this is exactly what Hamas deliberately does, that it operates from within civilian areas, making it very hard for us to target them, even though they would be lawful military targets. Okay, so the precautions rule, which is, I think it's your casebook at 246. So if you look at 57.2A2, small 2, this is where you take all feasible precautions in the choice of means and methods of attack with a view to avoiding or minimizing damage. So, Adriana, if a state has high-tech precision weapons, like the US does, is it required to use them as a matter of law pursuant to the precautions rule?
I think that it could be because that's going to minimize the amount of civilian casualties. And I think as a matter of policy, it definitely should, because I think if other countries in the world know that the United States has those weapons, which they do, they're going to judge the United States very harshly if they don't use those weapons and they use weapons that cause greater civilian casualties and losses.
Right. Right. So I agree with that. I especially agree with the policy argument. Does anyone want to argue that the U.S. shouldn't, as a matter of law, have to use its highest tech precision weapons every time it acts? Yeah, please.
It says to take all feasible precautions, and perhaps because of the expense or availability of these kind of weapons, maybe using them in every situation isn't feasible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be one of the counter arguments to that. Mark?
Well, and kind of going on the same lines, it also creates a disincentive to creating more advanced weapons.
Right.
Then you're tying your hands and saying, now I have to spend more money every time, so maybe I shouldn't make these better weapons, so I have more options.
Right, so we know you know how to do this because we've seen you use these precision weapons. Maybe you've run out of them, as David suggests could happen and surely does happen. Then you've got to make more. That's the kind of weapon you've raised the bar for yourself, and that's what you have to do because it's feasible for you to take those precautions. It does impose a bias against more technologically sophisticated countries, making it either harder or more costly for them to fight these conflicts. And states like the US, I think, try to emphasize that that's not the only kind of precaution that Article 57 is talking about, right? There are other precautions that we just talked about, like leafleting. But Adriana makes the good point that public perception is really important here, and that if it's perceived that we are using less precise weapons when we have more precise weapons, that doesn't win hearts and minds. Right? Okay, any questions about these law of war principles before we move on to drones? Okay. So I had you read Harold Koh's speech from 2010. This is on the casebook at 397. And this was the speech is notable because it's the first time that the government really got out and started talking about its use of unmanned aerial vehicles, which is the term that it prefers. And it was prompted by this increase in stories about the US using drones to target individuals in Somalia and Yemen and Pakistan. So we're going to focus on the use of drones to engage in lethal strikes, but keep in mind that drones are used for a whole lot of things, many of which are not that. Right, so they can help forces that are in the field see over the next hill. They have handheld drones. You can basically launch by throwing them. They sail over, they let you see who's on the other side of a hill or mountain. They do a lot of hovering to gather intelligence and apprise fighters of what's going on the battlefield, troop movements, people planting IEDs. They were used at a hostage standoff in an oil refinery in Algeria a couple of years ago. And they are also easily targetable by other states' armed forces. They are slow moving and they fly reasonably low, some of them do. So the contexts in which they've generally been used are when you're fighting non-state actors that don't have the same ground-to-air capacity, or you're not in an air-to-air type scenario. They fly about 80 miles an hour. The Predator flies about 80 miles an hour. And of course, domestically, they're going to start to be used for a whole lot of things, including potentially by Amazon to deliver your Amazon Prime orders. But that is a domestic question that we are not going to take on here. Before we sort of roll up our sleeves on drones, it's useful to remember that the history of warfare and weapons is this idea of increasing the standoff distance from your enemy. So war starts with hand-to-hand combat. Then somebody figures out, well, maybe I can throw a rock at Lewis and keep him away from me so he doesn't get to strangle me with his hands. Then you start seeing people on horseback. Then you start seeing people throwing spears. Then you have a crossbow further away and potentially more accurate, right? And then guns also allow you to stand back more and are quite lethal. And then as you fast forward into the 20th and 21st century, you see things like Tomahawk missiles fired from ships in, say, the Gulf, traveling thousands of miles, and high-altitude bombing, right? The goal is to hit your enemy with greater accuracy while keeping yourself safe from him. So I want to ask, how are drones similar to or different from those tactics and weapons that we've just seen the historical path of? Is a drone just the latest on that continuum? Or is there something different about drones? Anyone think that drones are somehow unique? Alvin?
Yeah, well, there's no person there.
Yeah.
So the standoff distance is on the other side of the world. And that's a significant difference. As compared with even like with high altitude bombers, like you've got an Air Force, you can go after those and exact some sort of, I won't say revenge, but you can at least thwart some missions like that. With drones, you can't stop them.
Right.
Because as long as they keep being built and flying over your territory, what are you going to do?
Well, how about warships that are floating 1,000 miles away that can launch? The Russians just showed that video of 26 strikes off their giant ship into Syria. Is that different?
I still think of it as a little different because the missile itself is the projectile. Whereas the drone is the actual thing firing the missile, and that doesn't have the person in it. that the person's in Nevada, and there's no way to get at that person. You can get at the ship, and you can't get at the ship because of capacity. Then I guess you have luck, but the missile itself is not firing itself. It gets fired by a person from the ship.
And so that makes a cognitive difference to you.
Yeah, I think so. Because at least, again, a lot of countries can at least get at the ship or attempt to. Even ISIS can put someone on a boat and try to go after the ship if they have that. If they're in the region. Right.
Well, if you're Russia, though, you could get at the guy in Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, right?
Yeah.
So depending on the capacity of your enemy, it may or may not make a difference. Ann, did you have your hand up?
Oh, no, but I agree with Alvin.
Okay. Yeah, Ryan.
But I mean, also doesn't the drone itself, you may drop a missile or whatever, but can't you attack the drone if you can find it, I guess, if you have the capability? And isn't the drone kind of going to take off from somewhere, maybe closer? I don't know where they send these from, if it's from like a base in the region or a base in the USA.
Yeah, so I don't know for sure. I don't have classified information on this, but the U.S. has a bunch of bases or has a big base in Djibouti, and it conducts strikes in Somalia. So presumably it's not flying the drone from Nellis. Might be operating the drone from Nellis or from Djibouti, but it's in theater, I think, right? It's, drones have limited distance capacities as well. Ann?
So I agree with Alvin from a targeting perspective, but I think from a surveillance perspective, I think that it's more in line with what we've seen historically. Because I mean, when you think about the fact that we've had reconnaissance, we've had spies, we've used air balloons, we've used flights, I think in that respect, I think drones are quite in line with the historical and practical warfare.
Right. Air balloons not quite as stealthy as drones, right? Okay. Yeah, so Alvin raised something that I think is intuitive to some people, which is that the operators are often much farther away from the theater than warships, and they go home at night to their families, right? There's something sort of strange about fighting a conflict during the day and going home to watch TV with your kids at night. So the drone pilots themselves, who let's assume they're sitting in Nellis Air Force Base, are unlikely to feel physical danger. You might feel a little bit more physical danger on a ship that's launching a Tomahawk missile. It feels more like you're in combat. And yet, drone pilots at Nellis have PTSD at reasonably high levels. So they, in some ways, don't feel as though they are removed from the battlefield. What's Harold Koh's argument about why drones promote the law of war principles that we just talked about? Kyle? What does he say about drones and proportionality and distinction?
He seems to, well, first he talks about how the rules of law don't turn on the weapon system used, and so he tries to emphasize the procedure that goes into using the drones. So the great amount of planning to ensure compliance with the distinction and proportionality, and so the fact that you may be carrying these missions out with drones doesn't change the fact that there's still a lot of work going in behind the scenes to ensure that you're still distinguishing between civilians and military objectives.
Right. Does he say that there's anything sort of advantageous about drones in this context? Why might drones help you comply with distinction and proportionality? Anyone? Lewis?
Because it combines the ability to do your reconnaissance and your targeting at the same time.
Yeah.
Allow to loiter and get a pattern of life for hours on end and say how many civilians are in there. And they would, they'd call back as a line Operation Troy, where they talk about they would call back and check the pattern of life of these compounds for hours on end before they're shot. And so like Harold Koh's talking about, it helps you with your distinction, making sure you've got a lawful issue.
Right. So it helps you ensure that you know what the target is, and it helps you ensure what you know about civilians in the area you're trying to target. This is especially where the target is pre-planned, right? But it can reduce the number of civilian casualties. Plus, you can linger afterwards to see what happens in the aftermath. Lauren?
To that same point,
Yeah.
I was thinking of like when we sent cruise missiles in '98 after the embassy attacks, the
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda attacks. I mean, it takes hours to launch those, and even the travel time could be, say, a half hour. So the situation could change a lot between when you fire it, you can't unfire it.
Right.
And maybe something changes in the meantime.
Right. Within a half an hour, you can have a busload of school kids pull up next to the building you're about to target. Whereas with the drone, launch the missile to target, it's a much shorter period of time. I mean, I think it's like a second. If you can see, actually, you can see a video that Israel posted online on YouTube of targeting a Hamas member in a vehicle, and you can see how fast it occurs. We should talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing to be posting that online, but anyway, so drones allow you to see who comes to the building afterwards, how many bodies get taken out. It helps you increase your post-event intelligence. It's also possible, and Co doesn't really talk about this, but we might wonder whether you have a certain, that the individuals who are piloting the drones are less affected by the heat of battle than you would be if you're flying over in an F-16. I don't know that, but there's a tension, right? On the one hand, the US has been very cautious to not say, well, it's like a Game Boy mentality. They don't want a perception that the people flying the drones are treating it like a video game. And the fact that they get PTSD, I think, is evidence to the contrary. But there may be a sort of ability to keep more calm and have sort of maximum intelligence when you're not directly there. Okay, so I wanted to parse out some of the debates that surround the use of drones and see if we can break it down into different issues. The first issue is one of collateral damage and debates about how many civilians have been killed in these kinds of drone strikes. So at one point, John Brennan said, the US has killed 600 militants since 2010. He said this a while ago, so this is not a recent figure, but they've killed 600 militants since 2010 and not a single civilian. And that made the headlines. US claims hasn't killed a single civilian, because it seemed in significant tension with some of the other reports that NGOs and others following this issue had come out with. So it seems like that can't be right. And he later walked that back a little bit. In part, when the US says no civilians killed, it made people wonder how the US was defining militant or enemy combatant, right? And that raised other questions. Was it defining it so broadly that it was encompassing all military-aged males, for example? But there have been a number of actors who have tried to pull together reports on civilian deaths. There's something called the Small Wars Journal, which did a study on this. The Center for New American Security did some. The average percentage that they can estimate, if you take those reports together, is that 5 to 20% of the people killed in these strikes are civilians. That seems like it's not a very precise number. But it's certainly not 90%, and it's not 0. And note also that there are incentives from some actors on the ground, including the Taliban, to overstate the number of civilian deaths, right? It is to their advantage to claim that these US strikes in the sky are killing many, many civilians. So I think the way the US probably tries to get accurate numbers is, again, it watches the aftermath of strikes. It watches the funerals that happen after these events. And it intercepts cell calls of people discussing who was killed in the strikes. So that's one big debate, is how many civilians are being killed, how difficult it is to figure out accurate numbers, especially when you're talking about, sort of remote west of Pakistan, where you just don't have intelligence people on the ground to make accurate assessments. A second reason that drones can be controversial is what I'd call the CIA angle. So the CIA is reportedly in charge of some percentage of drone strikes, and DoD's in charge of the other percentage. Well, why is that? Why not just have the military do it? So it's not entirely clear, but it might be because it's sometimes the CIA that has the best relationship with the host states in which the targeting is taking place, or the host state trusts the CIA to make fewer mistakes. So this might have happened in Yemen. There was a strike that targeted a wedding party. It was thought that DoD had been involved in that, so maybe Yemen says, look, you can continue to conduct drone strikes, but only if the CIA does it. There's also some notion that the CIA strikes are more deniable, right? They're presumably done as covert actions. But it's not entirely clear that's true. The US military is not running forward to claim responsibility for its strikes. Kyle, would the CIA have to comply with the laws of war when it's conducting its drone strikes? Or is it exempt from the laws of war?
I wouldn't say that it's exempt from the laws of war. It seems that I think there's some suggestion in the supplement that even the intelligence community can be prosecuted for laws of war or violations of the laws of war.
That's right. So the laws of war make no distinction about which state actor has to comply with them. States that are parties to the law of war conventions, and all states are bound by customary international law, whether it's Intel, whether it's DoD, whether it's the State Department, all of a sudden engaging in armed conflict, everybody would have to comply with the laws of war. No carve-outs for Intel. How is the CIA different from the military, though, Kyle? Should their involvement with drones affect how we think about the U.S. use of drones? Are there reasons to be more worried about the CIA doing it than the military?
I think to some extent, given the covert nature of a lot of the CIA activities, it may seem like there's a greater risk that there's less transparency, and that's always a concern when there's such a high risk of civilian loss in these activities. But I think to a certain degree, given their experience with surveillance, I think that it should be expected that the CIA is going to continue to utilize these drone strikes and may be more effective in some of their surveillance techniques, so that, as Ko was saying, that might actually help with the distinction and proportionality concerns.
Ryan?
I think it might also be problematic because it blurs the line on our side between civilian and military actors, because we can criticize the other side for, we don't know who civilians and not. But if you're saying before, if we start saying CIA is military actors and taking part in armed activities, then what about the State Department? What about these other things? And are other people going to attack us because they don't know who's really taking part in this?
Right. Well, so let's assume the CIA is still considered to be a civilian agency. If you were a CIA official engaged in actually, firing missiles from drones in targeted killing, and you happen to find yourself in Yemen, and Yemen happens to decide that it wanted to prosecute you for murder, right? This is a far-fetched hypothetical for lots and lots of reasons, but you would not be entitled to prisoner of war status or combatant immunity in a way that the military might, because you're a civilian official. So it wouldn't be a war crime for you to strike a military objective, just as it wouldn't be one for DoD to strike a military objective, but you would not be entitled to prisoner of war protections on the tail end. There's another question about whether the CIA knew or knows the laws of war as well as the military. That was at least a question when this first started happening. So say 2002, there was a drone strike on an individual in Yemen. I don't know whether it was CIA or military, but one of the early questions was, well, look, the military is deeply trained in the laws of war, and the CIA is a newcomer to this game, so maybe they don't really understand how you go about assessing distinction and proportionality questions. My prediction would be that by now, that hurdle is overcome, because the CIA is reportedly has been in this business for many years at this point. A second concern, and this is Kyle touched on this a little bit, is that the CIA is generally not subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, where the military is. So it might be harder to punish wrongdoing than it would be in the military context, where there's a regular process for it. Okay, so that's the second cluster of concerns about drone use, is CIA involvement. A third cluster is what I'd call transparency questions, because the US government has not been highly transparent about who's using what drones where. Right? There's little understanding of what the US government's rules of engagement are. There is no claim system that has been established, unlike, for example, in Iraq, where if you were a civilian injured by multinational force operations in Iraq, there was a way for you to claim damage to your property or harm to your person, and the military could pay out. There's no equivalent for drone operations. And there's also, therefore, not a huge amount of public and media oversight of the programs. There's another criticism that has come up as well, and that's that the US has leaked strategically about certain aspects of the drone program and remained very tight-lipped on other parts. So, for example, it leaked that there was an OLC opinion related to targeting Al-Qaeda. It told Charlie Savage of the New York Times that, but then in litigation, it stoutly resists revealing things about the program. So I think in an effort to address these kind of transparency concerns, since 2010, you have seen executive officials and often senior lawyers in the executive branch give speeches about drone use. So Harold Coase is the first in a series. Jay Johnson, who is the DoD General Counsel, gave a speech. Steve Preston, who was the CIA General Counsel, gave a speech. And John Brennan, who was at the White House at the time, gave several speeches related to drone use. Brennan, for example, acknowledged that the US uses drones to strike Al-Qaeda, including outside the active battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq. And that was seen as a revelation, even though many, many people knew or thought they knew that was happening well before then. And Brennan says things like, well, binding the US government to international law and the laws of war is a strategic advantage, not a hindrance. We want to come out and own the fact that we are bound by or are treating these rules as binding us, because we're worried about what happens when other states that are less responsible start using these things too. So I'd say that's the third cluster of issues. The fourth cluster is this question of having skin in the game. And that came up a little bit when we were talking about whether drones are somehow different. The law of war does not usually require you to take additional risks to your own troops to achieve a specific goal. It doesn't require you to be present on the battlefield. There's no rule that says you have to be there. Though it does require things like ensuring that your weapons are not indiscriminate and, of course, complying with the kinds of laws of war we've just talked about. But apart from the legal requirement, one question comes up more as a sort of policy or moral matter, which is there such a thing as honorable combat, and is the use of drones outside of that? Is it somehow dishonorable to have a machine basically doing the job for you? To be clear, you know, there is an individual saying, shoot that missile. These are not robots doing it, but is there something that sort of tastes bad about this? What do you guys think on that? Is this just, hey, we're technologically ahead of the game, this is just another step of adding in standoff distances and increasing accuracy and tough noogies. Brooklyn?
I think the conversation may get a little different when other actors have the abilities to use drones at the rate that we do. I think for now, it's a little bit harder to make those arguments, at least for myself, because I kind of feel like I'm arguing into a void. But I think when we start seeing drones as more widespread and autonomous weapons and vehicles as more widespread, this conversation may open up and people on one side of it may start to think about the other side and they find themselves potentially targetable.
Yeah, or it might just be seen as sort of the ordinary course of business rather than one side having such a significant advantage over the other side. Greg and then Lauren?
I think there's a sense in which as the standoff distance gets wider, it becomes then easier to actually strike, and it makes war easier in a sense. I mean, I guess in some way, all laws of war are like that, but there's a sense in which it becomes, not quite the Game Boy mentality, but just lowers the cost so much that it becomes easy to resort to violence. Whereas like when we step back, kind of the international law regime is that this is all supposed to be kind of a last resort in general.
So I actually have been thinking of that as the fifth category. This is the sort of changed incentives to resort to force. But I agree that there's a potential link there as well. But the sort of the fourth question, this question about honorable combat, is really, I think, one sort of putting aside how you got into the fight in the first place. Are you somehow being dishonorable by not exposing yourself physically? Mark?
Yeah. See, I don't think so. I think that at a certain point, when you're talking about asymmetric warfare, it's so difficult to find these individuals to begin with, and then how much risk do we have to put our forces into to try to extract them or to target them, that if anything, I don't even know if drones actually level the playing field with their ability to hide. And so I think it's an attempt to get an advantage back.
Right.
I'm not even sure if we even have that advantage.
Right. So that's an interesting point. I think Israel, for example, would say absolutely right, that it's a way for us to try to deal with the way Hamas is fighting its conflict against us. Lauren, did you have something?
Yeah, that was kind of, I see it more as, on a gut level, as a tactical difference. So groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS aren't observing international law, and we're going to stick to that, but we have a technical way to overcome some of our, self-imposed restraint.
Right.
And they don't have the technology to do that. That's unfortunate for them, but it's a way for us to get back at least something.
Right. I think that's a sort of helpful way to think about it. Okay, so I guess the final thing I'll just mention is what Greg raised, that some worry that because drones allow the U.S. government to put fewer troops at risk, it makes the U.S. government more willing, or whoever has these drones, more willing to resort to force in the first instance because it lowers the domestic political costs of doing so. It may also allow foreign states to more readily give consent to have the U.S., for example, go in and use drones against Al-Qaeda, where it would be harder for that actor, that state, to consent to having 10,000 ground troops come in and address the same issue. Okay, so I think we're out of time. I'm going to stop there, but I just want to say I've really enjoyed this class. You guys have been great, and I hope you keep reading the newspaper every day with a view towards what we've talked about here. So thanks.